Welcome back to Trending in Education. Dan Stratford, Mike Palmer, and guest Tarlin Ray along to talk about a zeitgeisty topic. Got to it first, Mike. Okay, boomer in the headlines across multiple newspapers, news outlets, social media. Of course, you look at TikTok, you look at Twitter. It is rampant, and how it plays both in the workplace and in education. We'll talk about that and more throughout this episode. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited always to have our generational expert, Tarlin Ray, in our midst. And as you mentioned, Dan, this is very zeitgeisty. This is very spirit of the times. It's in the news. It's going viral. It's very shareable. Is it snackable? It's probably snackable. It's all the good things. And speaking of all the good things, we got Tarlin. I mean, come on, right? What more could we want? We're talking zeitgeist, we're talking generations, and we're talking to Tarlin Ray. It's gonna be a wonderful conversation.
I just feel your energy.
There it is. Tarlin, how are you?
Mike and Dan. It's raining for the first time out here, which actually makes me happy. I like a little rain.
Yeah, you're out in Southern California.
Southern California. There's no gloom. There's no gloom when it rains because we need it.
Yeah,
we need to put out the fires that continue to rage,
right?
And we need to help Mother Earth. So I'm in a good mood. Thank you for having me back.
We will dive in from here. Tons to talk about. This has been in the news and throughout social media. Northeastern actually had a recent paper on this that I want to quote directly from here to start. The sort of origins of OK Boomer has been via social media, something I did not know. Apparently on TikTok, the sort of video platform where you combine dancing and music that many Gen Zers are using, it has the phrase has amassed almost 1 billion views. So the phrase being used across videos has amassed over 1 billion views. And Mike, I think that's a good jumping off point of the origin of the phrase, the use of it on social media, a Gen Z maybe origin story that has been then adopted by millennials to sort of group age groups here somewhat liberally at the top of the show. But this is caught on and obviously has become a phrase that has become very popular across multiple different mediums. Any thoughts on the growth, the origin, and where we now stand with the phrase and how it's come to be?
Yeah. First off, we got to get our TikTok game together. Like trendy. When I think video dance moves that appeal to Gen Z, I think trending in education. So I feel like, a little follow-up work for us.
I'll fly out for that.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
First time on TikTok.
We'll workshop that. But yeah, TikTok's an interesting. TikTok is sort of the new version, the new hotness for the younger set, sort of picking up where Snapchat was leaving off, and it's not surprising to me that OK Boomer emerged from there. Taking a step back, it's kind of hilarious that this generational stuff is treated as though it's real.
Right.
There's aspects of it that are real, of course. There's age effects, cohort effects, and period effects. Those are all real things. So like, how old are you? Who's in the group that you socialize with and you're exposed to in your day to day, and then what's going on at a macro level in the period you're living in. Those things are real. Turning that into these sort of constructs of generations ties back to the pseudoscience of Strauss-Howe, and Tarlin loves when I talk Strauss-Howe, so I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. But it's super interesting to think about how this relates to like macroeconomic situation that's emerging. The boomers are getting older. They're likely have to work longer. Gen Z and millennials are taking on a lot of student debt. They're not sure what the future is going to look like. And then it's also interestingly tied to global warming and climate change, which reminds me back to when we were talking about kid solving and sort of the Parkland incident and how much these, the way Gen Z and millennials to a certain extent are really activating through their right to assemble and their right to free speech It does. It harkens back to the 60s a bit. Don't trust anyone over the age of 30. But it also feels a little more frothy and fake because it's so powered by social media and what's meme worthy and all that. So yeah, Tarlin, what?
Let's talk about it for a second. So
Yeah.
it's 1 billion views on TikTok.
Yeah,
And Dan, Mike, you spend a lot of time on TikTok.
100%. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So it really, the boomers in this whole OK Boomer movement had no idea that this was probably going on, right?
Yeah.
So to your point, it's a way to, back in the day, you'd say whatever, or there are
Yeah.
phrases that were out there, and it's
Yeah.
a way to create content, a way for them to release some pent up anxiety, frustration, and point it in direction of people that have power and that they believe have created the world that they're in today. And this is the way they can get back. So fun videos and things like that are the way that they get out. So really, when did they jump the shark? When did they become something that now boomers are sensitive about or know about? Because I think for a long time, they had no idea anyone was talking about them and they were living blissfully. So was it the moment? And I'm trying to remember the woman in
New Zealand,
the lawmaker Chloe Swarbrick.
Yes.
When she's only 25 years old as a lawmaker in New Zealand, which is amazing in itself.
Yeah.
But hurled, fired OK Boomer phrase because her colleagues were heckling her.
You're right.
So is that the moment that it becomes something that we're now talking about?
Yeah.
Because prior to that, they could have had 2 billion views. And no one would have, the boomers, no one would have known, it would not hit the news.
And I love that you brought up jump the shark, which is like, that may not be, that turn of phrase I think people understand, but only those of us of a certain age who understood how cool it was for Fonzie to be water skiing in a leather jacket, jumping over some live sharks, understand the actual root of that turn of phrase. But it is kind of hilarious, to your point, though, that the way this stuff reaches the broader audience is very much limited by the media channels that they consume. So it's almost like it's got to be almost like broadcast media. It's almost like got to be covered on like television. Like by the time it was on Fox News and MSNBC, then that the boomers probably saw it because that's like their main channel. And also once it crossed over into, I'm sure it started on TikTok, but I'm sure it crossed over into Facebook.
Yeah.
And once it's in Facebook, the boomers, the hip boomers are at least on Facebook. Many of them are on all these platforms. Although honestly, if you're a boomer and you're on TikTok and you don't have grandkids, like
it's a little creepy.
You may want to check that choice.
I think we have lots of lanes to go down from here. The origin story being clear, and I think that the harken back to jumping the shark works as well. To understand as these things grow and as they become mainstream and as they become something that many people refer to. I had seen it fairly regularly on Twitter over the summer as a phrase, something that had started to be a flippant response to someone that you assumed was a boomer, assumed was part of that generation, for a take on the economy, college cost, or the environment. Like that seemed to be the reaction, use, and phrase. Tarlin, from your viewpoint, just how interactions happen on social media and how we learn from these things, is a flippant phrase going to cause social change in your eyes, or is this sort of just some angst and some anger that is being blown off by a generation that feels like they've been left the check, left the bill for a prior generation?
No, it's not a real conversation. So there's, if someone's saying, okay, boomer, you would say, you just said it's either oftentimes tied to the environment. Some people tie also to political corruption and what's going on in our government, college tuition costs, but it's not oftentimes why people are saying it. So if you're on the other end, you're the boomer, you're going to shut yourself down from the conversation. You feel like it's just another phrase that's being thrown out there, or something that these kids these days are saying where they truly don't understand. And I have some boomers in my life. You like to say that there continue to be lifelong learners, but they're fully baked, mom and dad. They have their perceptions, they have their beliefs. So unless it creates a dialogue, so what's behind the phrase, then we're now just shouting something else into the echo chamber where people really aren't understanding each other and we're not having real discourse.
Yeah, I totally agree there, because like it also does, it goes more viral on Twitter and elsewhere because it's you're kind of trolling old people, and it's like, oh, that's exciting. Look, it's so edgy that you put that out there. Oh, you really pwned them. PWNED. You're welcome. But there is an element of that, and that brings me to, I know we're going to probably talk a little bit about Harvard on this show, so I wanted to Harvard's a university in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that some of us may have heard of, but Harvard Business Review wrote a really great article about how generational stereotypes and metastereotypes are really damaging. And I think that's kind of what I was picking up from what you were saying, Tarlin, too, is that, the idea, first off, the article talks about the fact that the differences between the generations are overstated to begin with. So to say that, a boomer behaves this way, or, millennials are snowflakes, is just like, it's a stereotype, it's damaging, and it's not actually based in reality. So that's the first point. The second point is that the metastereotypes are almost even more damaging. And the metastereotype is the perception that people of that class, so that in this case, boomers, the way they think they're perceived by other generations can actually change the way they behave. So, for example, a boomer who is sort of shutting down in response to the okay boomer phenomenon when they hear about it, may wind up feeling less comfortable talking about how their work goes, or talking about their, how they're trying to engage with technology, or how they're trying to learn something new or different. The meta stereotype that everybody thinks I don't understand this stuff can actually begin to be internalized, and actually can sort of create even bigger divisions between generations, when what we really need is more mixing of the generations. Like, there's a lot of research that talks about, diversity and inclusion among folks throughout their lives. The more that the generations are actually interacting with each other in a positive way, is hugely beneficial. And meanwhile, work and life is becoming increasingly segregated by age. So, like, I think those are really interesting ideas that relate to kind of the surface phenomenon of okay boomer. And I did think that article was worth spending a little more time on, because, like, especially understanding that, like we've talked about the end of average on the show a bunch of times, like, identifying anybody by one attribute of them is hugely limiting. And then a lot of this stuff does really smack of ageism, really in all directions. Like, to act as though you really understand who someone is based on their age is a real dangerous stereotype to begin with. So, like, I thought that area was interesting to talk about. I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on that.
Do you want to go, Dan?
Sure. I think that as we try to tackle the discussion points, the self-fulfilling prophecies that come true, like, as you keep saying something, people start to believe it, is the biggest concern. Mm-hmm. And so from a learning perspective, from an education perspective, from a workforce perspective, I think the more we can talk about just knocking down those stereotypical barriers and getting rid of them in our lexicon. Yes, okay boomer is fun. Like, there is a certain sense of seeing it on social media and seeing the discarding of somebody in that way it can be funny, but it is also limiting. And Tarlin, you said before, it limits the discussion. It limits the ability to have an actual conversation around these topics. So stereotypes exist and they grow, and they now, I think, in social media grow that much faster and bigger and are shared across multiple platforms. So I think as a workforce, as learners, as educators, it's just incumbent to try to get beyond them and focus on that intergenerational work groups and understand how that plays in diversity and inclusion. I know we've talked about this before as a group. And Tarlin, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I know we've had this discussion before on how this plays and how you see the generational divides that end up, end up being sort of discussed and then become true because they were discussed, playing out in the workforce and in education.
Big question. Daniel always has big questions.
Yeah.
Just going back to the article, I think, and thanks for sharing it ahead of time as well. It's interesting where younger workers will see themselves or think of themselves as, or believe that other people think they're unmotivated or responsible. Older workers, probably their perception is that they're Luddites and that they are slower and can't keep pace. And that in actuality, especially as you think about the boomers, younger workers think about them as being responsible, hardworking, and actually a place they go to for counsel. So just understand the reverse. I mean, I'm not a boomer, but I talked about on this show, on this podcast before, not wanting to be old man on porch, saying, yelling to some of the younger workers. Yeah. And I've already started to flip to believe that behaviors that I take or positions that I take may feed into a stereotype because of where I sit as a Gen Xer. So I think it's massively hard. You got a lot of what you read out there, how fast information is flowing, and just because of when we were born, we're just behind the 8 ball because we weren't born with this powerful pieces of technology out there, the internet and other things. It's going to be massively hard to individually change the perception. So one of the things they said in the article is to fight ageism and to remove sort of this artifice, which in generational divide, is actually have these conversations as a manager, talking about stereotypes and metastereotypes. And I think that is also a really tough place to dive into as well. Not as hard potentially as some of the conversations around race, but I do believe that it has it's a very sticky issue, and I believe a lot of managers, if they're trying to tackle it, are not prepared to have the conversation.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what kind of trainings are going to emerge for managers? Really, it does. To me, what's so interesting about it is that, particularly when you take a really wide view of diversity and inclusion, is when it gets super interesting. So like even in the example of let's say we accept that the younger generations who grew up with screens have more natural competencies with those technologies. When they're developing them exclusively within a group that is young, so like they don't have any Gen X on up in their sort of product development function or whatever they're building or whatever they're trying to start, it's likely that they're not going to have new ideas or different perspectives that would ultimately make those outputs better, because ultimately the markets that you may want to tap into, it's the same argument for any form of diversity and equity and inclusion. When you're sort of thinking about decision making, you actually want to have as many varied inputs as possible to make the group process as effective as it can be. And I think you're right also, Tarlin, that like this is a safer way to get into diversity and inclusion. I think safer in that, like I think it's probably, while it's still emotionally charged, it's likely less likely to sort of go in a dangerous direction. But even the whole concept of how dangerous the direction is, I think, is frequently overstated. I think it's more the tools that we could equip managers with to have tougher conversations. It's actually something, no joke. It's something that I think podcasting can like model the types of conversations that, the tone of the conversation, the way you can kind of lean into some of the more challenging aspects of some of these topics. I've been surprised, maybe not overly surprised, but I've been a bit surprised that there aren't better training materials and better practice that folks can go through, as not just as managers too. Like, I think lots of times employees want to lean in on this as well, to feel a sense of connection to the organization. I do think there's a real opportunity here, and I think we'll probably gravitate back to the frothier okay boomer stuff in a bit. But any thoughts on that, Tarlin, just around like the training and whether where and how leaders and individuals can kind of lean into the diversity and inclusion, equity conversations in the workplace? Because like, it does seem like there's so much work to be done. Like, the fact that okay boomer exists almost is it just sort of signals that like any way people can identify themselves, there's going to be really emotionally charged conversations about identity and inclusion. And I'd love to get your perspective on it, because I know you've sort of attacked the problem from a few different directions, but just, how do you think about using conversations like this to show like that it's okay to talk about difference, and it's okay to kind of structure a healthy discourse within a workplace? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think oftentimes you come into the office, you are stacked with meetings, and you're trying to get that next project out. I think an opportunity to work in an organization where you had to try to find some time and space in a month to sort of have some meatier topics to discuss. Mm-hmm. What we had the benefit of having people that were spending time, their own personal development time, digging into the topics, so we can open up the conversation in a safe way. Mm-hmm. I think when it comes to boomers, generations, if you believe the CNBC recent article that came out, boomers are the fastest growing sector, or fastest growing population of the workforce. 65 to 74 coming back in. People are living longer. They want to be able to contribute. They need to potentially come back in the workforce because they're living longer. The amount they had saved for retirement is not going to sustain. Mm-hmm. So if you know that population is going to continue to flood in, it's going to be the largest group, you're going to have these conversations. Because imagine an organization where you go from 22 to 70. That's just a different range of experiences, mm-hmm. perspectives. And I think it's healthy to, I think the best way to have some common ground is actually enable people to share their foundation, share mm-hmm. their sort of contextualize who they are and where they come from. Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes it's easy to, okay, boomer, or to label someone because you lack context. So mm-hmm. I think within an organization, you can do that. Obviously you need to focus on what's most important: value for your customer, value for your shareholders, delivering top line, bottom line results that you continue to sustain as an organization. Mm-hmm. This is the way that you become healthy. If you're thinking about engagement within an org, that's how you become healthy within the org, is mm-hmm. having that type of space. So it's gonna have to happen, because right. there's not less. It's not their boomers aren't retiring out and I don't have to deal with them. Like, they're gonna continue to be in the workforce.
Yeah, and I think it's also like, at least much of the research that I've read about this talks about how no matter how you slice diversity, whichever dimension you're looking at diversity on, more diverse groups tend to make better decisions. They tend to be more creative in terms of the types of solutions they explore. So like, ultimately, to me, the strongest case for diversity and inclusion in the workplace is that it is in fact good for business. And that's sort of the way to kind of like almost get whatever emotional baggage people have, put it aside for a second when you are actually looking at the bottom line for your business, and when you're looking at your culture and how you make decisions. If everybody in the room that is making these important decisions is over indexing on any dimension, it's dangerous. And like, I think that insight, it's dangerous aside from just being unjust. It's just dangerous in that, like, you're going to have groupthink, you're going to make bad decisions, you're not going to be creative. There's nothing added to the you have 12 people in a room, all of the same age, all of the same race, all of the same gender. There's no additional perspective added by the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th person on that board of directors, for example. And that to me is like, that's the big idea. And the fact that it's good for business is the thing that, like, I want to do a better job, even like just driving home on that message, aside from the fact that I know it's also something I feel strongly about is just the right thing, and I get more personal fulfillment out of it. But I think it's all kind of nested in the same idea where, like, if you're not seeking out diverse perspectives, and if you're not trying to empathize with all the variability in modern life, you're actually limiting yourself. And in the case of any sort of business effort, you're actually creating arbitrarily low ceilings for yourself in terms of your potential. So any thoughts on that, T. Ray, while we have you?
No, I was just thinking, the way you're saying it's good for business, this goes back to the conversation we had following the Business Roundtable coming out with their 5 core principles. And one of them, I don't remember all of them. It's about sort of focus on their internal teams, on their employees. And so what you're describing, I think, would fit within, we can find a way to weave and fit within what the Business Roundtable is talking about.
Yep.
And that goes to diverse perspectives, understanding each other, and hopefully not turning, and I think companies would tear themselves apart, but not turning companies and businesses into what we see just day to day outside in the news as they talk about our politics and everything else. So I think what you're describing would fit right in line with what Jamie Dimon, that group, is talking about go forward as they think about creating value and the way to have healthy businesses.
Yeah. And then the related thing, I think, is so that's in the business context. I think in a political context is where you're seeing more of this sort of arguably righteous indignation by the younger generations who are saying, look at our presidential candidates in the US, look at the average age of a senator, look at the average age of someone on the Supreme Court. Obviously, like in Congress, we're starting to see younger representation. And even in the example of New Zealand, a 25-year-old, folks actually can feel like, okay, that person gets me because I see more of myself in that political representative. I have seen a lot, and especially heading into 2020, like, how do you activate the younger generations when they feel like their representation isn't necessarily going to their representative isn't necessarily going to be someone they feel really genuinely understands them. Counterpoint, Bernie seems to be connecting with the younger set, even though he's in his 70s. But I think that's interesting, like the sort of political pushback.
He's putting out, he's putting out policies that are going to support them, speaking to them.
100%. Yeah, right. Absolutely. But somehow he's connecting, and he's developed, because to me, a lot of it is developing trust with people who aren't necessarily, directly in how you might identify yourself. And I think that's particularly challenging with the rising generations who feel that sense of outrage, disconnect, powerlessness in terms of the political process. Although it does seem like they're registering to vote. It's likely that they will be activated in the coming year. But I think it's almost like the perspective of being politically active is expanding beyond voting, particularly for the younger generations. And that's the other. It's like a Harvard show, but that's the other topic that I thought was interesting, Dan, that you were bringing out was the game The game, which is Harvard versus Yale, was where the climate protest happened. And even during that climate protest, I didn't know that until you shared the article, Dan, that the students, one of the things they were chanting was "Okay, Boomer." So, Dan, you want to maybe catch us up a little on that?
Sure. During the Harvard-Yale game, which is a big game every year in the college football ranks in the Ivy Leagues, there was a protest by some students about Harvard's involvement in climate change and policies on campuses across the country. And I'm going to say stormed the field. They did not. They proceeded to sit in the middle of the field and suspended the game, Harvard versus Yale, for a while. Yale went on to win in, I think you said quadruple
overtime.
But the part of it was that they were protesting. And oftentimes, Tarlin, you made the point, protests are to get people talking about things. And people now are talking about this protest and how it influenced the game. But one of the things, as Mike said, they were chanting "Okay, Boomer." So it all sort of comes together to what we were talking about before about climate change and blaming or putting that firmly in the seat of the boomer generation or what the Gen Z students here are doing on campus. So it was an interesting story, one that I was sort of following at first and read the whole article. Protest still works, right? The conversation is about what they were protesting, along with us talking about them using "Okay, Boomer," of course, but an interesting story to track.
Yeah, and I'd love to I know Tarlin has some affinities to that university in Cambridge. Full disclosure, they were not just protesting Harvard. They were also protesting Yale's
Right.
endowment as well, which is somewhat divested. But I think it's also like, how much were they targeted in their protest versus, loosely affiliated? Because I mean, I'm sure some students in watching obviously what was going to be a riveting football game, I think some of them probably were like, "Oh, that's cool. People are my buddy's running out on the field. Let me get in on that." So like, how much of it is specifically trying to target the really weighty question around divestment, which I don't think we necessarily want to wade into right now. Maybe a useful topic for us to pick up in the future. But I think just seeing that also picked up a lot of press, and then the fact that it's becoming it does seem very analogous. I think the CNBC article talked about this. In the 60s, don't trust anyone over 30 was a big thing that boomers themselves were saying when they were protesting the war in Vietnam. And now for "Okay, Boomer" to be sort of turning that around, and then when you see this collective action by Gen Z, that they're then sort of reverting back to the TikTok meme. So Tarlin, I gave you a little bit of cover on the Harvard side, but
let's not talk about the game. They won. So what's interesting is, would it have as much pickup? I thank you. I read the article as well. I'm going to read a quote, but would it have had as much pickup if they were not chanting "Okay, Boomer"? Because they specifically, the Washington Post interviewed a former Yale football player, and the comment was, "They're all supposed to be intelligent people. Looks like there's a lot of common sense that's missed their generation." Says, and it's from a 8-year-old gentleman
who was sitting on his porch,
smack dab in the boomer.
Yeah.
It goes to show this generation is all about themselves and not a football game.
Mm-hmm.
So now there were signs saying this is an emergency. The purpose of the protests was, these are two of the largest endowments in the world, and they want to use some influence and use this moment where they'll get pickup nationally to get them to divest from their fossil fuel investments. And I think that there's something around Puerto Rican debt.
Yep.
So I'm asking back, if they hadn't been, it's like in soccer, you're chanting "Ole, ole, ole." If they hadn't been chanting "Okay, Boomer,"
right,
would the articles have been written the way they've been written?
No.
Or would this fall in line with the protests? Similar are asking in Harvard and Yale to divest in the same way that Dick's Sporting Goods, after some terrible mass shootings in the States, made a decision to start pulling back on selling weapons in their stores, which they had which not necessarily was controversial. They lost some sales, but that was part of their, they believed to be the moral obligation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this "Okay Boomer" chant is potentially, at least for this article, is hurting in a way.
Yes.
Protests, because it's like a trigger for a boomer to potentially not hear what the message is.
Yeah.
And focus on these kids that don't get it, and they're attacking me in a way with this chant.
Right. Yeah, and the guy, he just wanted to watch a fantastic football game. Is really what's really sad about it. But yeah, I agree. Like it does seem like, Dan, we talked about this a lot too. Like lots of times the thing that goes viral can wind up undermining a deeper discussion. Same point you were making earlier, Tarlin. Like it's like the reptile brain. Like it's still in there. You can't shut it off. Like the stuff, I even made the joke, the 61-year-old was, sitting on his porch. I couldn't resist, because and it is sort of funny, and I think we have to, that's sort of like the next level, I think, is just understanding that it's complicated and we don't necessarily have the solutions, but let's try to go a little deeper than the surface reaction. And let's try to resist, dividing into camps in ways that ultimately are damaging. And at the same time, some of this stuff, I'm a big fan of Stripes, although a lot of people don't understand this reference, but there's also a lot of need for lighten up Francis nowadays. There's a lot of sure, point taken, okay, boomer is hurtful, but also hopefully you're like a grown person who has reached some fulfillment and insight in your life so that you can actually empathize with somebody who's 20 who's saying okay boomer to you, just like when you were 20 you were saying don't trust anyone who's over 30. So I think my other take, aside from this stuff is really important, is a little bit of lighten up Francis is probably, maybe that's me as a whatever Gen Xer who grew up on Stripes, but I just kind of wanted to put that out there.
I think there is a reasonable assumption that we all need to lighten up a little bit when it comes to social media interactions and expecting that to be nuanced at times when it cannot be, and then letting these things get under our skin a little bit more than we probably should across generations. I will include myself in that as well. As a snowflakey millennial, a cusper, I need to be aware of that as well. I will say, I think it's interesting, just a different topic about the media coverage of that protest and the SEO of it all. Did the protesters know using OK Boomer would get the story picked up more, or was it the other way around? Pardon me, that it did get picked up? And to both of your point, did their message get lost in the weeds a little bit because of that coverage, which is interesting chicken or the egg discussion.
If you read the article and you get below the fold, it actually addresses and starts to talk about the crux of the protests, and you have presidential candidates, congresswomen chiming in. So the OK Boomer chant could be the equivalent of the Tesla window breaking to draw attention to the fact that there's a new Tesla SUV coming out.
Yeah.
And Elon is a brilliant marketer. So this is a way to take something. Go ahead, Dan.
I think you're implying I'm supposed to read the entire article.
Exactly. And that's the challenge.
Yeah.
Right? You got to get below the fold.
TLDR. Yeah.
You get to the meat. If not, the clickbaity nature of it will, and as you're saying with social media, you don't necessarily understand tone, and you can't read body language.
Right.
And that is a big piece of communication.
Except on TikTok, you can read that body language, dance moves.
Coming soon.
But well done with the Cybertruck reference, Tarlin, too, because that's super zeitgeisty, and we love talking about Elon Musk, and he loves that we're talking about him too. So I have on good authority. He hasn't said that to me in person yet, but I think any discussion of Cybertrucks with Also, in addition to increasing sales of Cybertrucks, I think it did increase sales of rocks and bricks as well. So good job with the viral marketing, Elon. The open invite still applies.
As always, a conversation that will continue here on Trending in Education, of course, on social media as well. We'd love to hear from you all as you listen on Twitter at Trending in Ed, the same on Facebook, LinkedIn.com/trending in education. Of course, our website is trendingineducation.com. Tarlin, thanks so much for the time. Appreciate you coming back as always.
Thank you.
Mike, Dan, we'll be back again on Trending in Education next week.